We have put together a think tank and are starting to draft and compile our own. We're not calling them standards of care because that's a medical model. That's the WPATH model. We're thinking about calling it something like the gender care framework, but we're going to put together our own guide, our own authoritative set of guidance for how you conceptualize and treat gender dysphoria, because someone has to step up and challenge these people. I mean, they've held sway for way too long, and the science is bad. Their science is so bad. They're an activist-driven organization. I mean, how else do you account for, a standards of care that includes a chapter on eunuch identity? I mean, really? Are we really going to take these people seriously?
So we're here with Joseph Burgo, who is a psychotherapist, an author of many books on psychological subjects, widely published in most major publications, and also fairly recently, I think, became a co-director of an organization called Genspect, which is in the process of becoming Europe and perhaps the world's leading organization. I don't know if it would use the term gender critical, but an organization seeking alternatives to medicalization for those who are suffering from the condition of gender dysphoria. Burgo gave a talk at the Genspect Bigger Picture Conference, which just happened last week, where I was in attendance. Very interesting talk that I have republished on my Substack, entitled Autogynephilia and the Sexualization of Shame, that gave us an intimate look at some of his experiences treating male autogynephiles in his practice, and giving us a composite figure of one of the important pathways to cross-sex identification, which has been sort of overtly suppressed for the last couple of decades. In the clinical literature and in our popular understanding of what transgender identity consists of, but that is actually openly celebrated, which is a fact that I talk about in my prefatory notes to his essay by, many of the leading transgender writers and thinkers of our time, including a person named Andrea Long Chu, who is a trans-identified male who has medically transitioned. I actually at one point saw, or actually may have even received, the funeral that this person gave for her penis. So threw a party for that purpose in advance of his bottom surgery. Who just won a Pulitzer Prize, and who won a Pulitzer Prize for works that overtly declares himself to be an autogynephile, talks about the autogynephilic structure of desire, and nonetheless at the very same moment where one is not allowed to talk about that. And so it's that very weird epistemological caesura that I'm interested in excavating. In my own view, it is the function of a kind of nether logic that governs a movement of people who are not what they say they are, demanding recognition as not what they are, in a movement that is not what it claims to be. It claims to be a civil rights movement, unleashing those who were inherently born in the wrong body on the basis of a disembodied, non-observable gender identity that is deserving of legal recognition, as opposed to a group of people who are suffering from a psychological condition that entails a lot of pain, that in some circumstances may not be quelled by anything other than some kind of surgical or hormonal intervention. I don't know. There are certainly those who say that they've been helped by it, but that for the most part, and I think this is part of what Genspect stands for, is something that ought to be addressed and can be addressed, right, through less medically invasive means. So Let's go over that essay and talk about, if you could just kind of summarize some of the points and talk about the people that you dealt with within it and the stories that you evoked.
Sure. Well, I talk about 3 different patients in this essay. And I describe, for the first 2 in particular, somewhat traumatic childhoods, a really damaged relationship with their own sense of being men, deep shame about who they were and where they came from, and that they escaped from themselves through this fantasy of becoming a woman, becoming something completely other than who they felt themselves to be. And what I found interesting was that the shame feeling, which is incredibly painful, becomes sexualized, so that humiliation becomes a source, an amplifier for sexual gratification. That was interesting to me. And, this is a small population of men that I'm working with. I don't have the experience that, Mike Bailey has or Ray Blanchard. But, I'm seeing these themes. I'm seeing that shame is a major issue, and that the development of a fetish is a way of coping with shame by turning it into a sexualized experience. My last book is about shame. I've been very interested in shame for years and years. And my book before that was about narcissism, and narcissism to me being a defense against unbearable shame, sense of defect, being damaged. Instead of being defective and damaged, you are superior, you're better than other people, you project all your humiliation into those other people. So what I'm finding is links between my earlier work on shame and narcissism and then this new population of men that I'm working with. Does that make sense?
Sure. So when you first encountered this population of men, and it was not that long ago that you first kind of took them on?
It's really only been the last year or so, year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What was the extent of your kind of knowledge base? What had the literature told you and to expect from them? Or did you go in informed in that way, or was it more just patients of a certain kind showed up and you had to figure out how to think about them?
I've been interested in autogynephilia for 10 years. And I wrote a couple of posts on my blog back when I was blogging in 2014 about how to think about autogynephilia, because it struck me as being a type of narcissism. I mean, to my point of view, what could be more narcissistic than taking yourself as the object of your own desire? I mean, that's, to me, I have everything that I need and want all in myself. It seems pretty narcissistic. I reached out in 2014 to Anne Lawrence, and we had a conversation back and forth by email about this. And she told me, which Mike Bailey also told me, that autogynephiles couldn't be narcissistic because they're not grandiose. And this was very frustrating to me. And it really encapsulates where I think we are in the mental health field, that you've got the DSM telling you that narcissism is a symptom checklist. And I talk about this in the essay, that, it has these features, primarily grandiosity, excessive need for attention. And that's not the way I grew up understanding narcissism. I went through psychoanalytic training. It's like, to me, narcissism is a defense against something. It's a defensive character structure where you're avoiding something that you can't bear to feel. Now, in my school of thought, the way I learned it was it's you can't bear neediness, you can't bear dependency. So instead of acknowledging need and dependency, you already have everything you need, right? You don't need anybody. In fact, it's other people who want you. That's true as far as it goes. That took me about halfway through my career until I started realizing I was at kind of a dead end with some patients that I wasn't understanding. And that's when I started getting interested in shame, which was neglected in my training. And I spent a lot of time reading, thinking, writing a book about shame. It totally changed my practice. And then, I began to think about narcissism instead as a defensive character structure against unbearable shame, which is what I was seeing in my practice, frankly, in myself to some degree, that my deeper understanding came from understanding the shame in myself I wasn't facing by, becoming, well, I had it all, right? I had the two-couple yuppie life on the West Side and 3 kids, and it all looked good. And then I, wasn't dealing with the fact that I was gay, so I, kind of had to get real, and that was a huge breakthrough for me. So I brought all of that to me when men started reaching out to me. One guy, I was on Sela and Sasha's podcast, and talking about narcissism, talking about these ideas. And then he contacted me and he said, I heard what you were saying. I just thought you might be somebody who could really have an open mind about what I'm going through and help me understand it. That's the first patient I describe in my essay. It's been a very powerful, very meaningful relationship.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this standard definition of what autogynephilia is, and just go back to basics, and let's talk about it. And how did we come to know that this was a condition at all, and what is it?
It's very simply, it's men's sexual arousal at the idea or image of themselves as a woman. So it's what we used to think as fetishistic cross-dressers, I guess, men who dress up in women's clothes and get off on it sexually. It's pretty simply that. It's just that. We know this from Ray Blanchard, who came up with the two types of different transsexuals, the homosexual, transsexual, and the autogynephilic. And then Mike Bailey wrote about it. Anne Lawrence did an exhaustive study on autogynephilia. But the thing that I find really frustrating is these histories are really they're accounts of a fetish. Sometimes I think of them as the fetishistic. Anne Lawrence I think of as fetishistic account of a fetish, that it's all about the fetish, the history of the fetish, when it appeared, how it affects their sex life and their relationships, with no sense that maybe it means something. I think I mentioned in my paper that Anne Lawrence got all this data and she deleted all the lengthy family histories of these guys as if that were peripheral to her study, which I find enormously frustrating. But I do think that's the way my profession is these days. It's the idea that symptoms have meaning, that they might have an unconscious significance that can be sorted out, that it's a way of resolving internal conflict, or it represents some defensive compromise. People don't think that way anymore. I mean, I do feel kind of like a dinosaur these days. That unconscious
so you have certain
meaning. Yeah.
You have certain habits of mind that are acquired through psychoanalytic training and practice that are just not part of the way clinicians think or practice anymore. Is that right?
It seems to me to be the case. I mean, I'm a part of another organization called GETA, the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association, and we were introducing a set of clinical guidelines, making a public announcement about how to work with gender distress. And what I realized as we were talking about it more and I was hearing from more people is people really aren't taught to do psychotherapy anymore, not the way I learned it. It's really become influenced by social justice ideology, and it's now more like supportive therapy based on where you stand in the victim hierarchy. And so it's not,
So there's not much help for the cisgender white male under those circumstances.
No.
There's just blame, isn't there? Or
there's just blame. You are responsible. You are responsible for everything. And I think in the third case that I talk about. It's this young kid I see who has been totally influenced by all of that stuff, hates being a white male, thinks that white men are to blame for everything that's wrong with Western civilization, and wants to opt out. He wants to be the bad guy, right?
Yeah. And so this kind of copy pasta that the culture has been vomiting at us for the last 5 years or so, we see it as, this is odious garbage, and it's a shame that it's being pumped out there. But there are recipients at the other end of that pipeline who don't have any defenses built up against it, and you're seeing some of them wash up on your.
Seeing some of them.
You're seeing their wrecks wash up on your shore.
Totally, but even before these guys came to me, the crisis in masculinity has been a big interest of mine. I wrote a book proposal, which my agent took out 3 years ago. So that would be before any of this. Really trying to look at positive aspects of masculinity. Yeah. Because I feel like men are just vilified. The American Psychological Association issued its guidelines for working with men, and it pathologizes masculinity. All masculinity is toxic masculinity. And it might be kind of funny that the gay man wants to do this, but I really want to support men in their male identities. I think men are in a terrible crisis in this country right now. They're in a terrible place, largely because I think they've lost many sources of self-respect, avenues for expressing their masculinity that makes them feel good about themselves. We've lost all these manufacturing jobs, all these traditional male occupations. And then, they're unemployed, and then they're told they're bad for being part of the patriarchy. So I don't know, it feels like we're in a terrible place in this country, and we need to do something to help men out. That's what I would like to do more than anything.
So there is the Of Boys of Men and Men. You know this book,
Richard Reeves' book.
Yeah. So I'm listening to it right now, and it's quite familiar with me because I read The End of Men when it came out, and so there's this sequence of nonfiction books that keeps kind of repackaging the same statistics about education and employment, right, and are like, something's happening here, and we don't seem able to operationalize it. Right, and make it a problem that the culture cares about, even though it's one of the biggest problems that we have. So your book looked at those kind of statistical indices, or was it trying to, sort of be in a psychological approach? Yeah,
it wasn't that kind of a book. It wasn't statistical. What it was, it kind of looked at evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, and what are the enduring traits on balance that men demonstrate in cultures across the world. And then by looking at different examples of people who appear to be non-conforming, to show how, in fact, they actually are expressing these valued characteristics. My favorite example is like RuPaul, who I think is incredibly masculine. He's
right,
ambitious. He's an alpha male. Just because he's a cross-dresser doesn't mean he's not masculine. I have an essay that I will finish one day called "Boys Will Be Boys Even in Drag." Right. Because if you look at the dynamics on that show, they're men.
Right. So I did read a book called "What Are Men Good For" by Roy Baumeister. Are you familiar?
I know who he is, but I haven't read that book.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, he makes various arguments. One of the ones that I remember is that the emphasis on self-esteem, which may be good for girls in kind of boosting their, actually leads to a complacency and unwillingness to strive when you give it to men, because you have to treat men, you have to treat boys differently. You have to motivate them differently. You can't just tell them, "Oh, you're good," because you have to treat them the way, football coaches do. Like, you're nothing and you have to earn it. Right. And so that's a kind of insight. And when you give this thing that may be helpful to some, to girls who might need a little stimulus to gumption. Right. If you give that to boys and you're like, "Oh, you're fine the way you are." Right. It's actually quite maladaptive for them. So the book is filled with stuff like that, and sort of.
Mary Harrington had an interesting essay this last week. I don't know if you saw it, but she was there was this example of a man playing a video game in the background, and while his wife was tending to the baby. And this was viewed as what a slacker, what a terrible, self-centered, awful man. And she very sympathetically said this might be the only arena in this man's life where he gets to achieve sense of through competition of mastery and building honor, through competitive mastery. I thought it was a lovely essay where she could see that men are different and they feel good about themselves in different ways from the way women do.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the book went out and there was no interest. Did you tell me that, or like?
I had 17. I had 17 editors in New York tell me that the author fails to acknowledge that masculinity is completely constructed socially, and that we can shape men through the correct methods to be the sort of it's the whole blank slate thing. They've totally bought into it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so you made reference to like Manhood in the Making, that kind of anthropological survey of like, there's pretty much, if you empirically go through all the cultures of the world, there's a coherent set of, rituals that speak to, a unitary, universal structure of masculine attainment, right?
Absolutely.
And that we want to design institutions and the way we raise men, in ways that are consistent with that.
Totally. I love Manhood in the Making. It's a really powerful book. And the other book I really rely upon a lot of my thinking is Carol Hooven's book, T. The kind of testosterone, the hormone that divides and dominates us. It's really helpful to, in a not dogmatic way, for her she just walks you through what testosterone does and why there's this bimodal distribution of traits between males and females. And, just to pretend that isn't true is crazy. Right.
I mean, half of the human race is constantly being dosed on a 30x dose of this very powerful psychoactive substance.
Totally.
And it accounts for all kinds of variations that remain, over time and across cultures. So there was no space for that. You didn't know that there would be no space for that, but you learned it, and then. So when were you trained? Because you were trained at a time when psychologists weren't like 80% women, right? Or is that also part of what's happened with the kind of blanket condemnation of masculinity that the APA that just did it recently?
Yeah, I think so. I trained in the 70s. And in my class, I'd say it was, So
you're older than you look.
I am older than I look. Don't ask me my age, please.
All right. Okay. All right.
And it was mostly, it was divided, men, women, but it was a higher prestige profession then. This is also before Prozac. Prozac changed everything, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Once we went, and the third version of the DSM, which I'm probably get it wrong, but I think it came out during the 70s when after psychiatry had kind of been disgraced and had to reinvent itself, they decided to change to the ICD model and have a disease model of mental illness with all these, medical sounding checklists. So and then Big Pharma came in and we've medicalized everything. So meaning has really been eliminated, and it's a disease model which can be treated with drugs. That's what mental health is today. Or CBT therapy, which is really useful.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so it had to be slotted in and operationalized with insurance companies and so on. So that's also part of it, right?
Right.
But you still got your training in a period where, it was a kind of conversational art form, and there would be some sage from Vienna on a couch that would kind of inculcate you into this meaning-seeking and meaning-making endeavor, and those habits still adhere for you.
I think about meaning. I believe in the unconscious. I listen for what people are telling me that they don't know they're saying. And that used to be kind of like, when I was a young psychoanalyst, that we were kind of like at the top, right? That was like the prestige type of psychotherapy. And now, I don't know, does anyone practice psychoanalysis anymore?
Well, okay. So, and a person who has that orientation toward a patient is definitely going to see a person who comes in and is like, oh, I feel like I'm a woman, right? If they're a man, like they're going to see them as a certain kind of problematic in a way that, like, obviously the movement, says that you're not supposed to see them as anymore. So all those changes happened, like over the course of a single career. And apparently you got married and had 3 kids in a heterosexual union and then decided and then realized you were gay. I did not know this about you, but
I was married for 17 years. I have 3 children. Okay. And then at some point, I think when I had my midlife crisis, I just sort of realized what I had been denying to myself for a long time. Not entirely. I sort of knew I had male attractions, but it just sort of became overwhelming. And, I've since spent the 20 years since I divorced from my wife with my husband, the same man. I also have one of my children is trans-identified and alienated from me. And that was my introduction to this space back in 2014. And it's part of the reason why I started getting interested in things like autogynephilia, because I just took a deep dive into everything about trans, trying to find out everything. And then I found out that there was this thing called autogynephilia, which seemed stunning to me. I'd never heard of it before. And, read The Man Who Would Be Queen and, Blanchard. And I more recently read Anne Lawrence's work. And, I look at these guys. I suppose it's partly because my journey has been a lot about making peace with myself as a man, feeling better about my own masculinity, which oddly I feel better about in my gay life than I did in my heterosexual life, my ostensibly heterosexual life. But I look at these men who come in and I think, well, doesn't it seem obvious that the problem is masculinity and not femininity? That these are actually men, they're biological men. Why do they feel so bad about themselves as men that they feel like they need to opt out? What's going on there? And that's not a way that I think the big names in this field think about them. They think about them, they've got this fetish, and that kind of explains it. It's probably genetic, or people at least are prone to developing it.
Mm-hmm. So you had these kind of deans of sexology, right? Blanchard and so on, who they created this typology. It was considered, I don't know if it was settled, but it was, the normal science of the time to say that, there's a taxonomy, transgender identified males are divisible into homosexual transsexuals, who are often, this is something that Bailey made, they're often from culture, like kind of macho cultures where it's not okay to be gay. And so and where it is okay to, be a woman or something along those lines. And of course, when we refer to, these other cultures that have these third genders, what they typically are referring to is cultures that have a very strict gender binary, where they have no way to accommodate gender nonconformity or male homosexuality. And so they carve out this space for sissified men to be hostesses or, whatever, sort of quasi prostitutes or courtesans. And that's the way they handle gender nonconformity. Right. Whereas we created this new medicalized apparatus it was kind of a gray area of medicine, right? This kind of half certified where you had these kind of medical entrepreneurs, surgeons who were kind of out on the limb, both kind of compassionate toward, but also sort of interested in experimenting, right, on like a population that wanted to cut their genitals off, right, and who were willing to, accommodate them. That's what transgenderism was. That's what Blanchard and Bailey were kind of taking these sort of touristic deep dives into. Very sympathetic though, right? Because even back then there were autogynephiles who wanted to deny that there was, or there were transsexuals who wanted to deny that there was any sexual desire. And I think what Bailey was willing to say was, look, there's AGP is real. There's some sexual desire. I'm not going to make that a bar, right? Like, I'm not going to gatekeep that. Like, I'm going to say, yeah, okay, there are people who are swallowed up by their sexual desires such that they start to want to not just be cross-dressers, sometimes, but like want to live their whole lives as women and want to entertain this fantasy that they were always women, trapped in men's bodies. And that's okay. He was actually very permissive, right? And this very welcoming figure, trying to understand, be empathetic. The Man Who Would Be Queen provides a really sympathetic account of AGP. I think much more so than may even be warranted, right? But for that very reason, him and everybody he wrote about had to be utterly dismantled, right? In one of the first real academic cancel campaigns. And I'm going to write about that. And so this knowledge that we had was dismantled, right? Like, you can't talk about it. You do a Google search, you find websites calling it this, like, this virulently transphobic, discredited theory of this prior backward generation, of men. So when you get to it at 2014, it had already been discredited, but like it was still true. I was still just like observably descriptive of reality. Right. So talk about your first encounters with it. I guess you didn't have patients at that time, but you had a son who was identifying as. I had a daughter. All right. Who was trans-identified as a boy and has medicalized and she's presently in contact with the rest of the family. But given who I am in this world, I'm forbidden from contacting her. Okay. I disappeared. I was so traumatized by the experience. I mean, we held off for 4 years. We did family therapy, individual therapy. We accepted her pronouns, her new name. We were, while I was trying to navigate and understand all this, we were monstered by the medical and psychotherapeutic community for my suggesting that there were psychological issues involved, which there were. I mean, A, I had dealt with gender issues in my practice, and B, I know my daughter better than you do. And, How old was your daughter when she came to you? This was 14 when she first announced. She's 24 now. Okay. So she was 15 at the time. Yeah. A high school student in Manhattan. No, we were living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina then. Okay. Yeah. And you were still I was divorced, and my husband and I had half custody. We were bringing up the kids. Okay. Along with my ex-wife, very cooperatively. So we parent well together, and we were kind of on the same page. We got therapy. It was very hard to find anybody who was willing to take a psychodynamic approach, something like the way I think, because not that many people work that way anymore. I found someone who I thought was good, and my daughter then said, no, I want to go to a different therapist. And she found her own therapist who was an affirmative therapist. Yeah. I didn't know what that meant back then. So we held off giving our permission for testosterone until a couple months before her 18th birthday, when she could do it anyway. And she did. It had a very drastic and bad effect on her mental health.
And she kind of went off on all of us and distanced herself from everybody else in the family for about 4 years. It was awful. So anyway, I was traumatized by that, and I stayed away from gender.
Yeah.
And then I guess it was 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, I just decided I was hearing about kids detransitioning, and I think I was hopeful that my daughter would detransition. So I started doing some research, and the first thing I came across was Benjamin Boyce. And he was my entry into the detrans world. And I listened to, a dozen of those interviews, and I started taking notes of all of the things I was hearing in the detransitioners. And I wrote a paper called When Gender Transition is a Cure for Shame, because I just kept hearing all of these themes running through them. And I just thought, okay, you have clinical experience, you know something about gender, you need to get involved in this space. So I first reached out to Sasha Ayad and asked her if she could help me get started. Would she supervise me? And she said, no, but you should join GETA, this new organization that's formed. I started getting referrals immediately, working with adolescents, trans-identified kids in their teens, really sent to me by their parents. And then I started working more closely with Stella O'Malley and Genspect, and I run the clinical portion of their program Beyond Trans, which is a psychosocial support for detransitioners. And then as part of my job was to screen the patients coming through who wanted individual therapy and to try and find a therapist to work with them. And I started inviting these young men into my practice because I was really interested in what was going on. And that's how I've developed, the beginning of an expertise in this area. And then, the other patient I described came to me after a wider lens, and I've had other people come to me because of that podcast. So it's been a long journey. Yeah.
So do you believe that your daughter, she's a high school student at 15 in Chapel Hill, she's one of the early rapid onset gender dysphoria cohort, female, no prior history of gender nonconformity, a variety of psychological comorbidities. Does she fit that profile?
Mostly. I would not say that there was no evidence of gender nonconformity.
Okay.
She was a tomboy.
Yeah. All right.
She was a tomboy, and I had always assumed she was going to be a lesbian, which would have been fine. I really didn't have a problem with that. Okay. I think she was somewhat she struggled to find a place for herself. She always felt like a bit of an outsider.
Yeah.
Had a harder time making friends, and I think she got radicalized by Tumblr. That's where she found it. And I think trans, it gave her everything she'd, always been looking for. I mean, at least it seemed to, right?
Mm-hmm. So when she came to you, there had been no real presaging, but she came and made a declaration that, I'm actually a guy?
What had happened was she was doing some tech theater at her high school. Yeah. And we went to a performance and we saw the program, and she had her boy's name listed in the program.
And you'd never encountered it before? You had no idea? No. And you're like, what's this name?
Yeah. And she gradually came out and said, yeah, I'm trans. And I handled it really badly. I did.
What did you know about trans at that moment?
What I did know, and this is one of the reasons why I, from the very beginning, had very strong feelings about this, is one of my first and longest cases I worked with was a trans-identified young woman. I started seeing when she was 17.
Okay.
And I worked with her for, many, many years and really got an in-depth understanding of what had happened with her feelings about her femininity, and had loaded all of her shame into her feminine body, particularly into her vagina, and wanted to opt out of it, wanted to escape from shame. So I knew a fair bit about what might drive, a desire to transition. And I could see a lot of very similar issues in my daughter, that she was struggling with some shame, some sense of being a misfit, an outsider, and she was looking to opt out of it. So I told her, that you can't do that. There's no such thing as being born in the wrong body. There's a biological reality. This isn't true. And I did it pretty bluntly and insensitively.
So when you say you handled it badly, you just kind of instinctively said what you thought was true, which was maybe not a thing, not the appropriate therapeutic response, I guess.
No.
And you are a therapist, so you know the appropriate response. But I guess with one's children, it's different.
Yeah, it all goes out the window.
Okay, so you did that, and my dad is a hateful transphobe, and so what happens then? And how do we get to and how do you what happens then?
Vis-a-vis my daughter, what happens then is she has a violent reaction to taking testosterone, and females are not equipped for these levels of testosterone. And she really went off on her mother, went off on me, and progressively over the next couple of years, cut us all off one by one until she had completely alienated herself from her family. She had an education trust that my father-in-law had set up for all of the grandchildren, which she was able to access and use in any way she wanted when she turned 21. Yeah. She used for top surgery and to live on for a couple of years. Right. And, very bad mental health. I won't go into all the details of what she went through, but she ended up in crisis and has, had a rapprochement with her mom because she really needs help. Yeah.
So, but at no point did you ever contemplate the idea that, maybe she's really a boy.
No. There's no one is born in the wrong body. I'm sorry. How does that make sense? Why would biology do that? Why would evolution make people that way? It makes absolutely no sense.
And your wife was in accord, the other siblings, now were you surrounded, was there already this kind of glitter family, and school affirming kind of stuff back then, or was it still a little early? Yeah.
Chapel Hill, Jesse Holmes once sorry?
They were already using her pronouns and new names at school, and they hadn't notified you, and that was the normal policy. And so all this kind of crap that we're seeing coming out, it was already fully in place back then.
It was already there. Jesse Helms, the conservative senator from North Carolina, once described Chapel Hill as a zoo that ought to be fenced off from the rest of the state. It's this hyper-liberal enclave of right-thinking people. They're all of them really highly educated parents, academics from Duke and UNC, and they're all supportive of this ideology.
So they took every kind of, they push out an update, right? Like a software update, right? And in places like in these kind of liberal enclaves, especially actually in ones that are surrounded by red hinterlands, right? They just take them up immediately. They don't question them. And being born in the wrong body, and that makes perfect sense to us. And so were you sort of already in tension and in crisis with both peers and with the school administration as a result, or?
The school administration we didn't have much to do with, but my interactions with I was set back, and I didn't really know how to cope with this. So when I approached the people that I thought would help. And I think I speak for parents all over America who are having exactly this experience. You reach out to the mental health professionals, and they'll tell you that you need to affirm your child's identity and you're a bigot. I was told that back then. And the endocrinologist who we consulted with just to get an idea of what the reality was of these drugs, I just said in passing, it's kind of frustrating that I can't find anybody who's willing to look at the mental health aspects of this, like what else might be going on. And she looked at me with utter contempt and said, "You're not going to find that." Like what an outlandish idea that there's a meaning to these symptoms. It was humiliating and awful.
Incredible. So, but you're a credentialed medical professional within this field. You're a colleague of these people. You have standing within that community, and yet somehow your divergence, the consensus had coalesced to the point where, and you hadn't even noticed this, and I think most people didn't, that your reflexive belief that of course no one is born in the wrong body, what already made you a pariah.
Totally. And I think, this has a chilling effect on the profession. A number of people at the conference talked about this, is that I know lots of people who won't go anywhere near gender.
Yeah.
Because it's just too fraught, or they've jumped on the affirmative bandwagon and have built practices, affirming children, which is unconscionable to me, but they do it.
Right. And there are many states that have bans. I guess North Carolina doesn't, but on what they call conversion therapy, meaning if you help a child be comfortable in their own body, you are converting them from this fleeting psychological sense that they have that they might be a member of the opposite sex, which we're going to reify and entrench as if it's their true identity, and any deviation from it is a crime.
Right. And which is insane. That is an absolutely insane position. And it's actually the opposite of what's true. Is one of the things that I'm very upset about is that a lot of these gender nonconforming kids who would grow up to be gay or lesbian are being converted to trans. Yeah. That's the real conversion therapy. In my here's another way in which I'm a pariah, is I used to sit on the board of directors and was an officer and friends with everybody at my LGBT center in Palm Springs, where I live. And when I dove into this space, and started writing, I gave them an article that I'd written, and I said, "Do you want me to step down? These are my friends." And they said, "Yes, please go away," because they've all jumped on board with the trans thing. It's, the LGBT center is now, everything is trans. And, if I speak up about, well, what if they're gay? There was a panel. This is my big question. What if they're gay and not trans? And I'm treated like, go away.
But you're still able to practice. They didn't cancel and destroy you, or they didn't try to, or they didn't succeed at it.
No, the fortunate thing is that I'm at a point in my career where I have enough money. They can't really, I'm in private practice. They can't cancel me. I mean, what are they going to do to me?
Well, I don't know. They, brigade your online, reviews. I mean, I guess there's all kinds of things they can do, but they haven't actually tried. Like, they allow you to exist. And they will periodically say something on Twitter about something I've written. And, my policy is never engage with someone who's obviously hostile or incapable of critical thought. I never engage. So it kind of stops, doesn't build up into anything. Yeah. How did this new consensus coalesce so quickly, though? Because you were once a normative figure in your field, and I think normal people once thought that it wasn't normal to believe that you were born in the wrong body, right? Like, I'm just fascinated in the mechanics of this sudden, rapid onset, right, coup that happened within the field and within all of society.
You've read the books. Many people are talking about, the long march of this ideology through all of the institutions. Yeah. So they're people better able to speak to that than I am. But one thing I will talk about, because it comes out of my clinical practice, is I think that this ideology, which is seems so detached from reality. The disappearance of teenagers into the online spaces in the wake of COVID and social media, and living in these virtual worlds in which I'm finding they're very detached from their body, which is, if we're not attached to our body, we can't rely on our senses and our emotions to tell us what's true, what's real. It's just this, you can just move words and images around in your head and create this new reality. So I do think social media and COVID and kids spending way too much time in virtual worlds has made them, is fertile ground for an ideology that just comes in and said, yeah, you can just change that, just like you can change your avatar. You can change your sex. I think that's a huge part of it, at least for the kids I'm seeing.
Yeah, so it has untethered them, and the question is whether it untethered them in a way that is permanent.
I hope not. I talk in a paper I just wrote, talk about, because I feel the exchange of words with these kids is often futile, where words are just kind of being moved around, but they don't have any connection to truth, is that I often instruct them in getting back down into their body, paying more attention to that, because there's these sensations around my eyes and at the back of my throat and in my chest. I don't know that I'm registering it in that way, but I don't know that I'm registering it that feel. So as I kind of teach them about getting, don't know what they feel. So as I kind of teach them about getting down into this, they don't even know what it is. They have no words to talk about it. So I'm hopeful that in this kind of work, you can reforge these connections. It's why I always tell parents, get them off the screens and get them outside. Get them doing something, using their bodies. Because these kids, they just spend so much time in virtual worlds, really completely out of touch with their bodies. That can't be good, right?
So you're able to practice with gender dysphoric kids from California, and where they have banned conversion therapy, but I suppose you would have to be reported, and I don't know if anybody has been reported and punished for pursuing a practice whose purpose is to arrive at, a non-transgender outcome. There are people who are doing it. You're openly kind of advertising it, and it's nominally against the law. Is anyone actually... Are people in fact prevented from doing the kind of therapy you're doing? You're not prevented, and I guess maybe nobody is. Or
the only person I know who was reported in that way was a therapist named Stephanie Wynn in Oregon, and they tried to come after her license, and she prevailed. So it didn't work.
Okay.
If they came after me, I really don't care. I would just resign my license and practice as a life coach. I mean, I'm just
right.
I just feel like I'm kind of immune there. I'm not worried about anybody coming after me.
Yeah. All right.
But a lot of people are, and I think the worst effect is not the people who are practicing and are afraid of being reported. It's all the therapists who won't go near it.
Yeah. Right. Just out of the risk is there. The risk may in practice be nominal, because if the parents are sending the kids, right, it's because they want that. And so even if it's nominally illegal, right, you're not going to get reported.
Right.
So nonetheless, it's enough to just scare everybody off. And that's enough.
Therapists are really scared. It's amazing how scared people are.
So as all these organizations are captured, right, and they announce that they're captured by the guidance they give about masculinity, or just the other kind of DEI copy pasta that they send out, right? They can. There's this dynamic where there's a push and a pull, right? They're putting all of their energy into stuff that is false, right? Into claims about the reversibility and the efficacy of puberty blockers that actually isn't evidenced in anything, right? That all these expert organizations and very highly prestigious organizations are willing to put themselves into with no sense that they are endangering their own authority, their own credibility. I guess it's a longer run thing, right? They're willing to spend it all down in order to get outcomes. But, eventually there's going to be some kind of erosion, and people like yourself can just be life coaches on a fee-for-service basis and get money. There doesn't seem to be any licensing or certification or legal thing. It's like this moment where, the only comedian you're allowed to like is Hannah Gadsby, right? And everybody funny, right? And
funny.
Right. And everybody funny you're not allowed to like, but it's like, it's all the funny people, right? And so it's like on this one side, you have Dave Chappelle and Louis C.K. and J.K. Rowling, right? And then on this other side, you have these regime apparatchiks, right? That nobody actually likes. Yet the latter still, right? It's like the Andrea Long Chu Pulitzer Prize, right? The Pulitzer Prize, the Nikki Hannah-Jones Pulitzer Prize, right? Like the prize still confers a lot of privilege, but they're spending down its ability to do that. And we're still at a kind of like this funny liminal stage of that process where nothing new has emerged to kind of take the place of these bankrupt organizations that announce their bankruptness to everybody every day. But that the kind of the basic configuration is in place for that kind of succession to happen, right? And so I guess that's where something, an organization that's where something like Genspect steps in, right?
Absolutely. One of the big problem with the transgender space is that WPATH, for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, has styled itself and has held forth as the dominant, unquestioned authority on how you treat transgender youth. It's been that way for decades. And there are organizations working in the background, kind of incognito, that don't want to come out, that are challenging their science, that are putting out studies very slowly in respectable journals. But there hasn't been any organization until now that's just come forward and challenged that authority and said, no, you don't get to just say, and you're not the only voice. So which is why Stella O'Malley, Alistair, Gunn, and I decided to hold this conference that we just held in Killarney, Ireland, which was at the same time, in the same town as EPATH, the European branch of WPATH, was holding their conference. Because we wanted to say to them, we're here. We have a voice. You need to listen to us as well. And we will be following them and holding another conference in November in Denver for the US PATH version. Okay. And we have put together a think tank and are starting to draft and compile our own. We're not calling them standards of care because that's a medical model. That's the WPATH model. We're thinking about calling it something like the gender care framework, but we're going to put together our own guide, our own authoritative set of guidance for how you conceptualize and treat gender dysphoria, because someone has to step up and challenge these people. I mean, they've held sway for way too long, and the science is bad. Their science is so bad. They're an activist-driven organization. I mean, how else do you account for a standards of care that includes a chapter on eunuch identity? I mean, really, are we really going to take these people seriously? Right.
So. They're in this funny liminal space as well, where they've clearly driven off a cliff. They already have driven off a cliff. They stripped out all age limits on hormones, blockers, and even surgeries, right? And they said that eunuch identity is a gender identity and is a basis for castrating someone.
Right. It might require surgical intervention to align internal identity with physical reality. I mean, if you don't think that's psychotic, then I don't know what to tell you. That's insane.
So they've done that. They've driven off a cliff.
Yeah.
It has been publicized. People know about it. It's maybe not as widely as it should have been. And yet they remain the gold standard. and people cite them as the gold standard, and U.S. clinicians go before Congress and they go before federal courts and say the reason why you can trust what we're doing is sound and life-saving we're resting our claim on the authority of this very important gold standard-setting organization called WPATH. And so they've gone crazy, and yet they haven't lost their authority in much the same way as the Pulitzer Prize Committee is still one of the most prestigious awards you can get, and they just gave it to the person who's saying being fucked is what a female is, right?
I know. Oh my God.
They gave him that award.
What's going on? Are you aware what's going on in Alabama? That they want WPATH to supply them with all of the evidence which underlies their guidelines to show the scientific basis for what this is great. This is what needs to happen because, the systematic reviews that have taken place in the Nordic countries, in the UK, in the state of Florida, all find that the evidence base for WPATH guidelines is poor to very poor, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, so we just go ahead.
It happened in Finland, Sweden, Norway, the UK. They all reached the same conclusion,
right?
And because you can't reach another conclusion, there haven't been enough studies to establish anything else. And the thing is, the affirmative model, which just says we're going to affirm anyone that shows up by default, that can't even be studied. That's not medicine. There's no protocol by which you could study that because there's nothing to compare it to. It's just a compromised finding, right? But what we are doing now goes radically, further beyond the kind of relatively sensible constraints that was placed on the cohort, that were the Dutch protocol. Those people had to be no other mental health comorbidities. They had to have affirming parents who were on board and participating. They had all these things that as we know from Jamie Reed and as just ROGD parents know,
right.
They're not doing any of that crap. No. They're not doing any gatekeeping or psychological evaluation. They're just transing them all and letting Moloch sort them out.
Well, and there's a lot of re-examination of the Dutch protocol recently going on. And, the one thing that sort of always gets forgotten is, it was a small study, maybe 72 people, and one of them died. As a result of gender affirming care. Isn't that like a big red flag? It's kind of amazing to me. And then the ones that they followed up with that long-term study, kind of lifelong shame about his surgically altered genitals. I mean, is that a positive outcome? Really?
Yeah. And he's the one long-term outcome, right?
Yeah, they haven't really. The follow-up in all of these studies is terrible, right? So, there is this process of hearing, AAP and APA and AMA making these pronouncements, and then assuming these are trustworthy organizations, assuming that they aren't. I mean, the term is. They wear them as skin suits, right? They gut them and then they wear these organizations as skin suits. And so that's what transgender activists and woke activists in general have done. Right. And so they've gutted them. They've replaced all their normative practices with, what I call astroturf pseudo-consensus, right? They impose this line that everybody has to buy into. And, But there's this process of discovery where you realize that we're through the looking glass. We're not in Kansas anymore, right? And you sound like a conspiracy theorist at that moment because you're this thing that all of these organizations
are telling us is real on the authority of clinicians from Harvard and Yale and so on. It's totally fucking fake. And how did that happen for you? I mean,
well, I don't know. It's really scary, and it's a very lonely experience, because what are you to say to people who don't know anything like what you and I know, right? And they see, well, the American Academy of Pediatrics thinks this is good. The AMA thinks it's good. All these highly prestigious organizations are endorsing this treatment. What are you supposed to say? I mean, you say, well, they've been captured inside by a bunch of trans activists who are wearing it, like you said, as a skin suit. You sound like you do. You sound like a nut job.
You're like, look at this post by Jesse Singal. He proves that this study is BS. And they're like, who? And then they do a Google search, and then they find all of these transgender activists smearing him. And you're like, you're talking about this hateful transphobe out there? It's like, no, he actually like looked at the data, right? Like, look at the way this claim was completely, and they're not following you at all, right? And like, you're the crazy person.
It's a very lonely experience. It's been, I mean, until I got involved with people, and so I had colleagues who were thinking the way I did, it was very lonely. I felt totally isolated.
Yeah. But like over a course of a few years, then you sort of found your way to Genspect, and now you're building an organization that can set up alternative, I guess not medical standards, but alternative approaches. You think you have a critical mass of people that are willing to take this leap with you? Or
I do.
In terms of providing the knowledge base, because they have done this kind of gender exploratory work and know how to guide people out of this wilderness, and then know how to put together a real body of knowledge, and then a group of people who are going to execute it.
I do think we have those people, and I think you saw the caliber of the people in Killarney, people like Michael Biggs, who can just take you through the evidence base on puberty blockers. We
Right.
do have those people. We have people who are talking about the infiltration of schools. And what we need to do about that. There's therapists like me and Lisa Marciano. There's, and Stella, of course. There's all these people, and I think there's more people out there than we know. Or that most people know. I know there's lots of organizations who have been operating kind of in the shadows, and people were really excited when Genspect came out and said, "Will you come? Will you come?" People are ready to come, and now there's a lot of excitement building about doing the same thing in America, which we will do in November. We just have to. I think we've changed the landscape by challenging WPATH in the way we did, and we just need to build it. We need to keep putting ourselves forward as an alternative authority, challenging their evidence and presenting alternative views. I do think that the tide has turned.
So, in your own experience, you have successfully led a gender-confused young person out of the wilderness. Have you done that?
I will tell you that it's painstaking work. Because it's almost impossible to argue for one position when the rest of the world is telling a teenager something else.
Yeah,
I mean, This has never been the case in my practice. I was always the authority, right? And and now I'm not the authority. Now I have teenagers coming in and telling me what's true. So I've made progress getting them to be a little more doubtful. I've raised doubts. Yeah. But even I'm affected by the fear of being called a transphobe and practicing conversion therapy. I can't come out and just say, nah, that's not a thing.
Right.
I can't do that. I've the other half of my practice where I've been much more successful is I work with detransitioners, particularly men who have lived as women and gone back to living as biological males. And that's like the patients I describe in that paper. It's incredibly rewarding work to me because then we're in it together. They have full buy-in, and I can say everything I think. That's, I think, to be honest, I'm not taking on any more adolescents.
Yeah.
Because
they're caught in a vice.
Yeah. I mean, these poor kids, and they're just so lost, and they've so bought into this wacky ideology, and you just watch them. It's like watching a train wreck. Like, really, you're gonna ruin your life. I mean, you're gonna these kids who are desperate to reach 18 so they can go on cross-sex hormones and dismiss any kind of evidence about the risks and dangers and long-term side effects of cross-sex hormones as just being, transphobic propaganda. You can't tell them anything. So I do feel like it's practicing with one hand tied behind my back most of the time.
Yeah. So, what I say is in the past, kids who did not understand the long-term consequences of their action would end up pregnant. Right. And now they end up sterile, right? And so, but they're still willing to show up. Their parents are like, well, we have this therapist for you, and they meet with you, and you try to help them with their other mental health comorbidities, and are able to have some effect maybe on some of those aspects.
Totally. I mean, I tend to avoid addressing gender directly, because then I find it just becomes this recounting of the law, the language they've heard on the internet, and it just doesn't mean anything to me. So I think my usual entry point into working with these kids is to say, look, if I'm going to help you sort this all out, I need to know all about you. I need to, you're not just, as Sasha says, you're not just a walking gender identity. There's a whole complex person. And I need to know all about that if I'm going to help you make the best decision you can when you turn 18. And that opens up the doors, because these kids do have complex lives. They have a lot of other things going on.
So you see these videos of like these girls who are like doing their gender announcement, right? And you're like, it's just a girl. And like the people that you're seeing, the teenagers, to the extent that you do, you're like, this is just a confused boy or girl. How could it be otherwise? But you hear in the language of the Democratic Party, of legislatures that are willing to ban conversion therapy, that are willing to deny detransition care almost entirely out of sadistic spite, right? Because they regard any concern for the victims of their policies, which they, according to their own dogmas, are not supposed to produce any victims, and therefore we have to punish the victims that we create, or not even recognize their pain, right? Like, just a complete unwillingness for them just to look at these actual obviously just confused kids. And I guess in some cases, some of these confused kids are their relatives' kids, or even their own kids. And yet something is preventing them from just seeing them as they are. And that is terrifying.
The Democratic Party is a big problem right now. I mean, you probably, were you referring to what happened in Texas this week about this bill getting voted down?
But it's happened elsewhere too, I think, right?
Yeah.
But also,
Yeah. For the audience who doesn't know, there was a bill that was actually sponsored by a lot of parents within Genspect, working its way through the Texas legislature. And what it was going to require providers of transition services, healthcare providers, insurance companies, to also cover complications from transition and those who wanted to detransition. And the Democrats managed to defeat it and cheered in the state legislature when it went down. I mean, that's crazy. The problem is the Democrats look at it as it's the next civil rights frontier. This is the new gay, and just trying to get them to see that it's actually not. This is not the new gay. It's entirely different, and this is not a question of civil rights. It's not what it's about. But it's like talking to a wall most of the time.
So why is it totally different?
Why is it totally different? Because, well, when I think back when, first of all, gay and lesbian rights are about the freedom to be attracted to, have sex with, and marry the people that they love, and just live normal lives like other people in society do. It was very kind of, I think that's why we ultimately succeeded, is because we kind of went like, we're just like you. Now, what trans is doing is rewriting reality, redefining biology, and telling the whole world that we have to adapt to their view of themselves and we have to conform to this new ideology. It's completely different. It's not about their individual rights, which trans people have the same rights as everybody else. It's about forcing society to reconceive of reality and sexual biology in a way that's just, I don't know, it's nothing like fighting for gay rights.
So this is what Mike Bloomberg said, if you'll recall. There was leaked audio of him just being like, you don't have to do anything different, to let someone be gay, and whereas, and he made a prediction that, if a big issue and the next thing is like, there's this guy that wants to be, showering with your daughter, right? Like, that's not going to be good for the Democrats. And then, of course, he had to repudiate this and he had to bend the knee and he had to, in order to run during that brief moment where it seemed like, he was trying to run. Right. And that was when we knew that there was that there was a greater power that was at work. Bloomberg owns the Democratic Party to some degree, right? And yet the activists of the Democratic Party were able to dictate to him, not the other way around.
It's really upsetting and really scary to me. And my big hope is that in the next election cycle, the Democrats are going to be punished for embracing this ideology. Because if you look at the polls, it's not a popular view.
It's not salient enough is the problem. I think, and because it is still rare enough that most people can have a very abstract understanding of it, right? And so that's why it's these, and of course you are one of them, it's these ROGD parents in blue enclaves. I have so much empathy for them. Like they're caught in such a tortuous vice that they know something to be true about their child.
It's interesting, isn't it?
The whole world is weighing in against them. What's that?
It's interesting that these kids are in blue enclaves. I mean, in environments that support this kind of progressive ideology. Yeah,
but they are everywhere too, because the internet is everywhere, and and schools in very red enclaves are also supporting the ideology because it is an ideology not just of the internet and of it is an ideology of this kind of clerical class, right? Who've kind of taken on a new meaning and significance, right? When they can, and so administrators and school officials, various bureaucratic functionaries, they've taken to this mission. And so, I interviewed someone who is a teacher at a town. She was like, yeah, this 95% of this town voted for Trump, but it's in Oregon. So and so they had to put tampons in the boys' bathroom, right? Like these mandates come from the state, they come from the federal government, and everyone has to do it. And of course the boys waterlog the tampons and trash the bathroom, right?
As boys will do.
Yes, of course. But what are they doing? They're revolting against the power that is going to be over them. So, that's... But you say that you feel that there's been a turn, and there has been a turn. Of course, we have these European countries that have made the turn.
Other examples of the turn. I mean, You've seen them. I mean, Robin Respo and her group did that great series of articles on gender medicine for Reuters, and the New York Times has actually allowed people to question the value of puberty blockers, whether or not it's worth the risks. Mm-hmm. So there was a huge uproar, of course. And Pamela Paul wrote that article defending J.K. Rowling. So, I do feel like the New York Times is opening things up. Yep. Barry Weiss and her group, the Free Press, they're covering gender. And she's got a huge reach. Yeah. There are signs of hope to me. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So in general, what is your understanding of the best practices? And I guess you can't really, for gender dysphoric youth, is it about just kind of like laying some foundation so they'll have something to lean on maybe 10 years in the future? How do you understand the process as a therapist, dealing with the gender frenzy in the moment, with the culture where it is, with the medical establishment where it is?
Yeah, it's with teenagers who are zealous about this new ideology. It's very difficult to open up a psychotherapeutic space and get them to think.
Yeah,
that's really kind of all you can do, is to try and encourage them in a process of critical thought, and to be more curious about themselves, like what else is going on and who they are. What are what other feelings do they have about other things? That's all you can do, because the rest of the world is sounding the drumbeat constantly of this ideology.
yeah.
So, that's the general principle. In terms of more specific cases, it's like with the girls, it's like,
Yeah.
what's so awful about being a girl? And there's many reasons. I mean, I have young adolescents who hate their bodies because they hate periods. They hate the idea of sex. They hate the pornified view of women, the sexualized version of femininity that they've encountered, and they don't ever want to have sex. So you have to help. That's part of it. I think with the boys, it's a lot about, degraded views of manhood, no positive sense of how you could grow up to be a kind of man you might like to be. It all seems terrible. Society hates you. So, I think those are the general principles, and then the two central issues that I see with boys and girls.
Yeah. And so those two identities that you described, the girls are a new way of being trans. They weren't part of the taxonomy, right? Like, you didn't have that population. They were memed into existence, right around 2015 by influencers, by Tumblr. And the AGP thing, it's like there are still homosexual transsexuals, right? And there are still those who were dysphoric from a very early age. And, I don't want to say true trans or anything like that, but those are those who are the truly dysphoric, right? Who and quite different from those who at an age earlier than, because the AGP is usually like, they're often, they were married, have children, they're cross-dressing throughout the whole time. And then at a certain point, maybe in their 40s or 50s, this is more the Richard Levine, right, trajectory, right? They decide that I have to live as a woman. And especially I have to rise to this moment where transgender identity is being consolidated. I want to have a part in that, right? And I want other kids who had cross-dressing fantasies when they were kids to fully enter into their fantasies and not have to look like me, right? Like, I'm going to give them that, that gift. Right. I think that's kind of what is driving it for him. And it's a mortifying, right? Like, awful thing to see being played out on the airwaves of this nation's, right? Like, federal government, and the president standing entirely behind him, and the president's spokesperson, right, 3 days after a mass murder, right, in a Nashville church, saying these kids fight back and we have their back, right? Like, those are actual quotes that she said.
I know.
So this is something from like RoboCop, right? This is something from some 1980s Terry Gilliam dystopian thriller that we are witnessing. I
want to say something about the AGP thing.
Yeah.
Because I want to write a paper called "Expanding the Blanchard Typology."
Yeah.
Because I do think, and if you're in online spaces listening to these guys, there does seem to be kind of like a new version.
That's what I'm saying. They're younger and they're right.
And they get into it in a different way. The third patient that I talk about in my presentation, I think, is this example of of boys who are growing up unable to identify any kind of a positive male role model, hate themselves as men, don't want to be men. So they've got this shame, this core shame that they're living with. And I think that they find these, well, I could call them groomers. I don't know what you want to call them, but these older men online who are seeing, they identify these low self-esteem boys, and they start flattering them and grooming them into these sexual relations, which, kind of alleviate the shame temporarily and feel good. I mean, masturbation feels good. These boys, it's a temporary relief. Then they feel awful afterwards. But I think it's this new formation of AGP that's induced by the moment we live in, this cultural moment in which men are reviled and boys are growing up feeling shitty about themselves.
Social justice education by maniacal man-hating women is producing a new way of being trans, I think.
It's weird.
And then our social media interconnectedness allows a group of, older, really damaged groomers to have access to these kids. And then once they get their hooks on to them, they then go to an affirming therapist who's like, "Oh yeah, you're a woman."
Right.
And then blocks their puberty.
But you can imagine the lure for a teenage boy who feels unattractive and feels terrible about himself to have this older man just heaping praise on him, telling him how pretty he looks when he puts on that dress. You can see how it's insidious.
I mean, this is what Stephen was talking about. Where he's like, I was groomed on social media. And if you go to certain sites, Egg in Real Life on Reddit, I don't know if you ever looked at it, but apparently, you have these young 13 to 17-year-old debutantes who show up and we're like, and then get heaped with praise by a population of older groomers. And it sounds to a lot of people like odious reactionary moral panic when you describe the facts. In the same way that, like, when you describe, all these organizations have been captured by entryists from the transgender agenda, you sound crazy, but all you're doing is describing what happened. And then you're like, there's a website where people, where boys compete for the attention of a population of older male trans-identified groomers who egg them on to and tell them that, you look like a girl, and then enter their DMs and start giving them gifts. Right? Like, this sounds like the gay panic of like the 70s and 80s, right, which I guess wasn't true, but this is true. And how do we talk about that how do we tell that truth without the Democrat and left-wing media being like, there's this terrible reactionary moral panic going on, which of course is how it's being covered in the Times and other places, even though they are...
all of my friends are saying exactly the same thing, and I try to point out to them that it's not happening in a vacuum. The Republicans are reacting to something the progressives did by pushing too far to the left. It's not just we're going to weaponize this thing out of nothing. It's like but it does feel crazy making. I mean, like, people, can say to you, well, why do you care about one or two boys going into the girls' bathroom? Why is that a big deal to you? Why do you care about, these drag queens reading to these kids? Why does that matter to you? And you can sound easily like a bigot if you harp on these things. But, somebody said on Twitter recently, it's like, why don't drag queens want to go read books at retirement homes?
Right.
It's like, what are you really? I say to my progressive friends, is Drag Queen Story Hour really the hill you're going to die on? You really think that's a great idea?
And it is incredible who can be induced into, by negative partisanship to just just like, oh yeah, start taking their kids to drag queen shows, right? Just to prove that they're not bigots or whatever. And I saw the beginnings of this with my 5-year-old daughter, where I took her to this like play space where they were having this thing called a rainbow party, which should have actually, drawn more skepticism on my part. But yeah, you had this little like 5-foot, very flamboyant man reading to these 5-year-olds about an LGBTQ parade, right? And I looked around at the other parents. They seemed like very normal parents. They didn't seem like some glitter, rainbow family. And I was like, does anybody else feel weird about this? And it's like, okay, like the kids don't understand it. They're too young. But this is obviously the beginning of a sustained conditioning that they intend to put all these kids through. And so we're going to leave. I'm not going to make a fuss. If I make a fuss, it's going to be, it's going to do the damage that like I don't want done, right? Right. To kind of spill all of this stuff that is just age inappropriate, right? For a 5-year-old. But I'm not going to go back. Right. And I was glad to see that the place shut down. But, I think it was COVID that shut it down. But that's now normative. Like that's right. That's the foundation of what everybody's getting. Now, as a gay man, right? Like you must feel somewhat ambivalent about all that, right? Because
I do not have any ambivalence about it.
Okay.
I think that drag is adult sexual entertainment. Yeah. And I don't particularly enjoy it, but I don't have a problem with other people enjoying it. It doesn't belong anywhere near children. It's just really simple.
Yeah. But what all this is supposed to do, right? It's like gays were bullied. You were in the closet, I guess, for a long time, and it's like, oh, we're gonna make it so that like no kid, is ever not affirmed, doesn't saw. I mean, obviously they've taken it to a completely insane place, but you see where it's coming from. Like a generation of people who were traumatized, right? And, by their experiences in very heteronormative schools. And I remember those schools, in the 70s and 80s, and probably more so for you, prior to that. So like there should be a way to just be like, look, we don't want kids to be bullied. We want to be comfortable with themselves, but we don't want to tell them bullshit about how anyone can be born in the wrong body, right? Like, I think the vast majority of people would be behind that vision, including people who vote Republican, be fine with that. And yet somehow we're not able to reach that point. And I don't know, like, is there a way to get there is my question.
I don't know. It feels to me that on the one hand, this era looks like we're this really tolerant, embracing society in which trans kids can come out. It looks so progressive. And yet, on the other hand, it's really regressive because what we used to do is we used to try to expand the opportunities for boys to be different ways and for girls to be different ways and to stop bullying for nonconformity. Yeah. Well, maybe we're not bullying nonconformity anymore, but now we're telling them, well, you're actually the other sex. Yeah. So we're
medicalizing nonconformity.
We are medicalizing them,
and we're eradicating it in the process.
But you do see if you look at the backgrounds of these kids, again and again, you see they were weird, they were somehow odd, and they were bullied. And when they transitioned, the bullying stopped and they became heroes. Well, who's not going to choose that route?
Mm-hmm. Right.
As opposed to being encouraged, stopping the bullying and encouraging. I don't know. It's very seductive, the idea of becoming the trans hero, where what used to be the loser and now you're the trans hero.
So that happens. And it's like, what we did at the school, we can do in the world. We can make the whole world be as supportive and we can force that to happen. And that's the kind of the vision. Because here's the thing, like the data says that like 60 to 90% will they will desist, right?
Right.
But they were desisting in the heteronormative world, right? Where, you would be punished for continuing to be, and now we're saying we're going to create this queer trans normative world, right? And then we're going to make it so that we're going to, in the same way that we're going to punish the bullies at school and we're going to make you a hero, we'll do that in a country of 350 million, right? And everybody who stands in the way of that is an oppressor, is a hateful Republican, is seeking genocide. All of this kind of, which also has the effect of like giving the kind of private discontents and identifications of these kids that they make recourse to, giving them this story of a great struggle. It's like the X-Men, right? Or, you have these monsters that are out to destroy you. And that has political utility for the Democratic Party, and that's why they have glommed onto it so quickly. And that's the vision, and so you have these kids that would have desisted in the past, but now you have a new kind of cohort that we socially influence into existence and provided all of these incentives for them to do this thing. And because we have selected for a cohort that is easily socially influenced, that means the social influence can be extended into perpetuity, right? And so we won't see the same kind of desistance so long as we are creating this whole virtual reality that we make coextensive the world, and we make the federal government and other entities, enforcers of that virtual reality.
Well, but my reality-based view is, okay, so we do all of this, and then you have this generation of young people who have come out as trans. They've seized their identity, and they think that they're done, right? That's an achievement. And they don't, one of the things I'm always saying to my kids is, what are you going to do after you transition? Like, how are you going to earn a living? What are you going to do for a career? I think in this generation is growing up thinking that they're done. Once they, so how will a society work when nobody really has any idea about work and achievement, and they just think they're going to embrace their identity? How does that work? That's not sustainable.
Right. Well, I mean, there are all these polls showing the number one, the number one thing that people, that children aspire to be is an influencer,
exactly,
on YouTube or TikTok. So the trans thing, obviously, in empirical terms, right? It is this vector to being an online influencer. So in a way, like Dylan Mulvaney sort of is the hero of a rising generation, right? Like he's the most empowered. He's Napoleon on horseback, right? In the year 2023.
They can't all be media influencers, right?
No, they cannot. That is true.
It's you can't all be movie stars. Yeah, you can try and be an actor, but there's only so many movie stars.
Right. And so, so your daughter taking her trust fund and using it all on surgery, right, it's like, rather than education, and it's like the kind of perfect example of that. But it's kind of like one understands the appeal, all of your problems, all of your insecurities, your comorbidities, everybody's telling you to route it into this one source, and then it's in the same way that the video game provides you a simulacrum of achievement and of competitive, you always have a set of goals, right, to achieve, to become this other thing, to become this transcendent expression of what you're being told is that your true inner self. It's this whole massive society-wide role-playing game that we created for a small subpopulation and dragooned the rest of society to participate in. We can see it in those terms because we're still securely enough rooted in the pre-virtual reality. But it's like all of these all of these organs of culture and society are working to make that virtual reality subsume reality. And so it is a kind of hyper politics in this sense, right? It is this thing that has not existed before.
It hasn't existed before, but I don't know. This is when I get really pessimistic. How does an economy function? I mean, we're going to become completely dysfunctional. Camille Paglia says that this kind of androgyny is a feature of late empire. We're collapsing, and China and India, they're not going to put up with this nonsense, and they'll take over the world, and we'll go down. I mean, how can we? Yeah. How can an economy? There's no economic future in this vision of trans identity. Like, there's nothing productive about it.
It is the specific form that a culture of pure signaling, a culture of pure narcissism takes. And so I guess this goes back to like the kind of your work on narcissism and shame. And maybe we can kind of wrap it up by kind of bringing it back to that, right? Because it's the metastasized form of these underlying precursors. Do you see what I mean?
You mean of narcissism in the culture? Is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah. It's this kind of terminal state of narcissism takes many different forms and many containers. This is kind of this final form where your narcissism is actually enforced by the government, right? Where the way I see myself is the way you must see me, and as you must. It's an evolution in the whole concept of what it means to have a right, and then to dragoon the state into being the enforcer of that claim, right? Like that's why it is fascinating to me, but like it comes from these antecedent movements in that direction. Right, like that we have operationalized and we have monetized, right, narcissism to the point where that all the powers at be are able to decree that it is a compelling moral imperative that others share in your false inner view of yourself, and that's a right that you obtain, and that if you don't have that right, a violence has been done to you, and that if society doesn't participate in that, in that false inner conception, then a genocide has happened.
And it justifies any kind of violence on your behalf, coming from you. I would, this whole idea of narcissism, the book I want to write, the next thing I would like to write, is really an update of Lasch. He diagnosed America famously as suffering from a narcissistic disorder. I think what we've got now is a culture that suffers from borderline personality disorder. Mm-hmm. And this my most recent essay, Living in an As-If World, is really looking at the way that this kind of detachment from reality, this as-if sort of existence that we're living, where you can just make it up as you go along, is leading to this, first of all, this detachment from reality, but also increasingly borderline behavior, where borderline rage, vicious assaults, attempts to destroy people, which is kind of what borderlines are like. It's widespread. It dominates Twitter, for sure. If you're on Twitter, Twitter's like a nonstop borderline rage all the time. I do think there's this cultural pathology that's gotten much, much worse. And I don't know, I just feel like, can we, even though I feel like I say the tide has turned, I think, can we really pull out? Can we pull back when the society is this ill? And I don't know.
So what is borderline personality disorder, and how do you see it manifesting in the culture as a whole?
Well, the personality disorders, but particularly borderline personality disorder, are characterized by an unstable sense of self that vacillates back and forth between feeling, like you're superior and then feeling like you're trash. It has unstable emotional states, frequent outbursts of rage when you are challenged, when you aren't validated. It's that people are prone to various kinds of addictions. They have a hard time forming realistic and lasting relationships. They tend to blow up their friendships, family relationships. These features, they sound to me like, if you look closely, they sound a lot like the way trans rights activists behave. That they really, to me, are the embodiment of a cluster B personality disorder, particularly borderline personality disorder. But then if you take it just on the way people respond to one another in space, on the way people will, be enraged about nothing and take other people down, if it will feel slighted and will go on, just go off in an explosive way. I think social media really is characterized by borderline kinds of communication.
And so people like that were disincentivized, or they were punished. They would fail. Their relationships would fail. They were never able to take their demands and format them in such a way that the state and medical establishment and educational establishment would recognize them and be on their side. That's the new thing, isn't it? Right? That personality configuration found a way to institutionalize itself and to win.
Yeah, that's a very dark thought. But yes, you're right. It's absolutely true. I mean, the borderline delusion is validated by the world now.
Do you think that there's going to be a decompression and a mass, because this new population that we memed into existence, right? Is reality going to? And I've talked about this infinitely extensible, socially influenced virtual reality that can be sustained for a long time, that our federal government and our Democratic Party has fully committed, and our major corporations, right, have fully committed to sustaining. Is reality going to prevail in 15 years' time when that population realizes, hey, it was never real? And will we then be able to pull ourselves back from this madness because reality will have reasserted itself in the way that reality always does? Or is reality postponable through power and influence and media domination and so on for a long time?
Here's my hope about reality prevailing. It's the next generation.
Yeah.
The younger kids. We talked about this, you and I, maybe they define themselves in antagonistically towards this ideology.
Yeah.
That might happen. Reality, I think.
And by the way, are you this referred to a tweet saying, by John Kay saying I'm hearing from parents about their, 8th grade, high school age kids that, now that this is the ideology coming from top down, they are rebelling against it. Are you seeing that, sort of anecdotally? And
I'm not personally seeing it, but I'm hearing about it. I want to see it. I really want to see it.
Okay.
But I come about reality prevailing in another way. I mean, it's an unsustainable fiction that we're selling to these kids because, okay, you're trans, but we still have to have a job. You still have to support yourself. And if we create a generation of kids who aren't engaged in the economy, who don't have any way to earn a living, what happens?
Yeah.
I mean, do we just all fall apart?
I mean, Stephen described a kind of group house in Vermont, with 8 trans-identified people. They're all from middle and upper middle class homes, but they're living on the edge of society, right? They're living this kind of outsiders existence, and I'm very interested in that milieu. And so that's the world you're talking about, right? These kids are only focused on their identities. They are not focused on anything else.
Is there any resemblance to the hippies who lived on communes in the 60s and eventually grew up and got jobs?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I mean, Bernie Sanders, right? He went to Vermont after, and then became what he was. He's this kind of, you have this kind of community of perma left-wing activists, right? And he was the most empowered of that group, right? And he challenged for the presidency at a certain point. And material old leftist who was an alternative to hyper wokeness. But I think there's been a merger and a melding where you have cities where that are running these experiments on defunding police and giving power to the nonprofit Borg, and where everybody has their pronouns, and where she, her is not enough. You have to be at least she, they, right, to have any credibility. And that's just one culture now, right? It's the AOC, Bernie. It's not an alternative. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a self-sustaining world, right? But like, you do have these detransitioners who, at a very young age, they totally passed. They were affirmed by everyone, but they realized, so everything that one could ask for, everything that Richard Levine couldn't have, that all the gifts that he wanted to give to these young cross-gendered people. But reality took hold at a certain point, and then they were like, "What the fuck did I do to myself?" Right?
Exactly.
And so to see those people. It's incredible, the power of the memeplex that allowed them to do those things in the first place. And it's a real study in sort of like human suggestibility and conformity and power, and just the way that signaling is enough actually to just like repeating some BS can really convince people to cut their junk off, right? But the fact that like reality eventually, like the rubber hit the road at some point, and they're like, of course this is not real. How could this ever be real? And I guess you've talked to a lot of people who had that moment.
I have, and it takes a long time. I think the average is like 7 years before you really start to experience regret. So we got a long way to go yet.
Okay, so this has been an interesting conversation. Is there anything else I should be thinking about, or?
Oh, probably a dozen things, but no.
Okay. Anything else you want to add?
No, this was a really great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Okay, good. Thanks a lot, and I'll post this. And the thing is that, like, much of the value of going to something like Genspect is just having conversations with people who are starting from the baseline of what's real. Because like I still have all of these, these triggers that have been induced in me, that like I feel weird and it feels cathartic to be like, of course this is not real, and because it's been so viciously defended, and I risk social and professional death by saying it. But you've been through it. You never wavered, and right from the beginning, you knew that of course this thing cannot be real.
Well, I mean, I realize there's all these risks out there for people, but you have to have integrity. You have to stand up for what you know is true. There's no alternative. How do you live with yourself?
Many people are exploring the other alternatives, and the answers are not good. It involves a lot of self-abasement and selling of one's integrity, and often involves hurting other people for their integrity. So
yeah, it's bad. Yep. Wesley, it was great talking to you.
All right. Thanks a lot.